Hello everyone and welcome. I have a bit of a different video for you today, but let me first apologize. My voice is still a bit raspy. You see, I've been sick for the better part of the last 2 weeks and it's taking me forever to get back to normal. Anyway, today I'd like to discuss character classes and which ones work best from a new player perspective. We're going to be looking at all 9 classes in a tier list format and plotting those classes across a distribution from strongest to weakest. This tier list makes a few assumptions. Firstly, that you are relatively new to the game with less than 30 hours played in total. It also assumes that you're still focusing primarily on learning the game, learning things like class matchups, team synergies, class mechanics, and cooldown management, etc. Lastly, it assumes that you are playing in low gear score lobbies. If not the under 25 gear score lobby, then certainly the under 120 bracket. Okay, so to that end, we'll be ranking these classes based on these following criteria. Firstly, class complexity on a scale from high to medium to low. This is really about the mechanics or amount of in-game knowledge it takes to be able to effectively operate a given class. Secondly, we'll be evaluating the role and build diversity options for that class, what roles a class can play, and how varied the weapon selection and build diversity can be inside the current meta, once again ranking from high to medium to low. Thirdly, we'll be evaluating spacing and positional awareness, and while this is probably one of the most significant skills for all characters and all players in Dark and Darker, some classes are considerably more forgiving with regard to spacing and positional awareness, a skill which many players don't have when they're first starting out. Once again, we'll be ranking this high, medium, and low. And lastly, we'll be talking about gear and stat dependency. We'll be grading this on a slightly different scale from extreme to moderate to linear. And this is really a discussion and a deep dive around the extent to which a given class or build will scale with gear. Some classes have a very straightforward relationship. They simply become better at what they're already good at in a very linear way as you start layering in additional gear and additional stats. Other classes play very differently, in some cases extremely differently, based on their gear availability and the availability of higher stat budgets. We'll be discussing those specifically as it interacts with several class choices. So first off, let's cover the Druid, which I'm going to go ahead and place in C tier. This is the most recent class to be added by Iron Mace, and it still feels a little incomplete. Its greatest strengths are in its ability to deny area to the enemy and its inherent best-in-class mobility options. It's not the most difficult class to pick up. As you can see, I'm kind of ranking it middle of the road in every category. It really has great sustain. It should be a really strong class pick for new players, but it has 2 factors working against it at the time of this writing. Firstly, area denial is extremely powerful, but area denial cuts both ways. If you make an error in placement or a poor decision, you are as likely to hurt yourself or your team as you are to inconvenience the enemy. Secondly, and this is painting with a fairly broad brush, but high mobility is something you'll value more as you gain in-game knowledge and experience. As new players, this class is likely to teach you a few bad habits and present you with a really challenging skill ceiling to aspire to. Also, the Druid suffers somewhat from the Cleric existing. The Cleric is a stronger support healer and a stronger frontliner in general. I would weigh the Druid far higher if the Cleric simply didn't outshine them in almost every overlapping role. All right, so it's time to talk about rogues. And it's time to talk about rogues knowing that I'm going to get a lot of hate on this one, but I'm putting the rogue into D tier. This class has one of the highest risk versus reward equations in the game. It's a fragile, high mobility glass cannon, and when it works, it seems impossibly broken, and when it fails, it looks like a complete waste of a character slot. It is absolutely best in solos or in squads filled with other rogues, but it gets progressively more challenging to play the class as you take it into duos and trios with other non-rogue classes. It is one of the best scaling classes with gear and gear budgets. It has the smallest number of viable builds and only a single role. I strongly recommend you avoid this class as a new player, or at least brace yourself for a very steep learning curve to master its high skill ceiling. If you are hell-bent on maining this class, you need to prioritize running mid to high gear score lobbies much earlier than any other class, as this class feels extremely better to play at higher gear scores. So now we get to talk about the Bard, and the Bard is one of the most well-rounded classes in the game. It can easily and seamlessly transition from solos to duos to trios, not just being compatible with, but desired by practically every potential team comp in the game. At its core, a Bard can thrive in any role, from a surprisingly tough frontliner to a backline support. Its build diversity with its song selection and its perks enable it to be played as a selfish DPSer one game and as a ranged support specialist in the next, with very minor tweaks to your build and to your loadout. The one notable downside for new players, the Bard feels a bit fussy to play. Between your buffs and juggling your belt items and instrument swaps, it can be very stressful to get the hang of this class. But if you're up for that challenge, you'll be in a position to learn the most about the game in the least amount of time. Positioning and spatial awareness is very important to the Bard, but its high mobility and relative toughness allow you to recover from positioning mistakes rather quickly, making it a lot more forgiving than, for example, the Rogue. From a gearing perspective, Bards don't need a big stat budget for them to excel, and simply get better at what they do best when you apply more stats to them. They play very similarly at a low gear score level, and a medium and a high gear score level. I have a lot to say about Clerics, but to jump to the end, I'm going to place it in an S tier. Cleric has historically been one of the strongest classes in the game, and that remains true today. Cleric's going in S tier for a number of reasons. Starting off with, for as a new player, it's straightforward and to the point. It is brutally effective in every role and has an amazing selection of perks, talents, spells, and gear. Its primary weakness is in its poor mobility. It's a slow class which can be easily kited, but it remains strong in solos and in duos and trios with only very minor tweaks to loadout and to gear. Cleric is one of the classes which Iron Mace has used as a yardstick to measure relative balance changes for all classes around for more than a year, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. It's one of the reasons why I strongly recommend Cleric for anyone who's looking to explore a ranged caster class at any point in the game. Which brings us to Barbarian. I see a lot of new players playing Barbarian, and I understand why. It's a very simple class to play, and when it's able to get into melee and stat check an opponent, it does very well. It's a bit of a new player trap, though, as it works very well against new players, but gets progressively harder to play as you face more experienced opponents. It has only one role, that of a melee frontliner. It has a remarkably narrow selection of weapons available to it, which only marginally improve as you layer in additional stat budgets, reach certain breakpoints, which make other previously unviable weapons feasible. Barbarian is a class which you'll likely find some early success with through both initiative and positioning, but will become more frustrating to play as your skills improve and bring you into contact with more skilled adversaries. Due to its fundamental design, Barbarian has historically been either utterly broken or a distant third choice in the frontliner category, with absolutely no middle ground. I don't foresee that changing until this class is essentially completely overhauled, as that's what it would take to really bring any nuance to its scaling or its design. So we come around to Warlock, and Warlock is going to be an easy choice for the B tier. Warlock is just a very solid class, which is S tier in a large number of ways, but held back from true greatness by a few other vulnerabilities. Warlock has a very low bar for entry and a very high skill ceiling, making it a very good choice for new players who can quickly pick it up, but it is also very difficult to master over the long term. It is significantly more gear dependent than any other option I've listed in the S tier or the A tier, but it has impressive sustain and survivability skills. It is the undisputed king of solo boss fights and can do really impressive things in PvE. The central challenge of the Warlock is plugging it in with other popular team comps, and it's held back by how difficult it can be to get to synergize the Warlock with other very popular classes. Warlock is a class which is highly dependent on good positioning, but has a lot of tools that help it, like Phantomize, which allow it to recover easily from positioning mistakes or from a concentration of enemy fire. Now it's time to talk about one of my personal favorites, the Ranger, and it's an easy A-tier pick for me. The Ranger is a very straightforward range damage dealer. When you can consistently land your shots, the Ranger becomes a very strong ranged option to plug into almost any team comp, while also providing some amazing utility. The Ranger has a single role and a limited build diversity. Positioning is very important for the Ranger, as is learning how to play around your own traps. But that being said, its spacing really comes down to learning when to create additional space between you and your target and how much space to create at any given time. These elements, relatively, are fairly quick to learn. Gear and stats scale very well on Ranger, and it goes from strength to strength with the addition of additional stat budgets. Time to talk about the Fighter. Longtime viewers will guess this right away, but the Fighter is an easy S-tier pick for Koopa. Like the Cleric, the Fighter has historically been somewhat of a yardstick, which Iron Mace has used to balance the game around. And it's my go-to pick for any new player looking to jump into their first few games of Dark and Darker. The Fighter is very simple but brutally effective. It can play multiple roles and play them well. With a single perk, it can literally use any weapon in the game and a vast majority of armors out of the gate. Fighter is one of the least challenging characters to play from a positioning perspective. With its broad selection of throwables and ranged weapons, it can put out effective damage regardless of any positioning mistake you may or may not make. With the sprint talent, you can quickly reposition into a position of advantage with relative ease. The Fighter has a linear relationship with gear. Adding a larger stat pool to your Fighter will simply improve on its performance across the board in a very predictable way. And as you can tell, we're down to Wizard. Last and sadly least. An easy pick for the D tier. I strongly discourage new players from investing time in the Wizard class. Historically, the team at Iron Mace has really struggled to find a balance for Wizard, and like the Barbarian, it's swung from being completely useless to completely overpowered and back again in back-to-back patches. The Wizard is a complex class which requires a very deep understanding of the class, how it scales with gear, and how it plays into each specific class matchup. For a new player, it's really quite similar to the Rogue. It takes a very large time investment before the class really starts to make sense, or when you at least start feeling like you're on fair and even ground with other classes. You have limited roles available to you and a very small range of viable builds with the Wizard. You will live or die based on your positioning and spacing, and knowing if your opponent is likely to die to the next spell you cast. Also, like the Rogue, the Wizard really needs a larger stat pool to feel rewarding or fun to play. I'd recommend you play it in higher gear score lobbies, as in the basic gear, it doesn't really sing. So, much like the Rogue, if you're planning on investing time in the Wizard, make sure to do so in the 120 plus lobbies to really get a good feeling for how the class plays. I'd like to reiterate, I feel strongly that all of these classes we've discussed are viable. I think some of them are much harder to make work as a new player, and some of them are incredibly tough to make work in certain team compositions. If you are getting frustrated with the class you've chosen, if it feels like you're not quite syncing up with your team, consider switching it up. I strongly recommend any of the classes in the S or A tier for you as a new player, as you really can't go wrong with any of these from a synergy perspective. Thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of this discussion. If you enjoyed it, kindly give the video a like and consider subscribing. Until next time, Koopa out.